I'd like to welcome our next session, Space, Cooperation, Competition or Contest. Start again. Space, Cooperation, Competition or Contest. We're pleased to welcome Michael Goldman, the Deputy Chief of Mission at the US Embassy, to provide framing remarks for the session that will follow. Please also join me in welcoming Chirag, Deputy Assistant to the President and Executive Secretary of the National Space Council, who's joining us live from the United States, and Brigadier-General Anthony Mastalir, Commander of the United States Space Forces Indo-Pacific. And this discussion will be led by Shrimpton, Director of the Sydney Dialogue at ASPI. Welcome to the stage.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Mike Goldman, as I was just introduced. I'd like to start off by renewing our acknowledgement of the Gadigal people, the traditional custodians of the land, and acknowledge their elders past, present, and emerging. I'd like to acknowledge and credit Justin Bassey and his great team at ASPI. Justin, maybe 3 years ago, you were quite literally the first person I met in the Australian government, and we've been mates ever since. So good on you. This is a really, really good event. So I was talking about this panel with my wife yesterday evening, and she looked at me, paused as she does, and said, "So now you're an expert on space, eh?" I do have a PhD, but like John Leslie, it's in political science, which I usually mutter because it's not a real science. But it does mean that I can speak glibly about things I know nothing about. So in that sort of spirit, I'm going to frame some remarks very loosely. I don't have a PhD in a hard science, but I do have a toddler, Miles, who just turned 2. And what I like to do when I wake up in the morning is look at the world fresh through his eyes. And there are 2 things he likes. He likes dinosaurs and he likes space. And mindful that I'd be delivering different remarks to a group of paleontologists, let me say that the money's on space in our family. It's just great to look at the world through his eyes and see the sort of excitement and wonder. Reminds me, as my parents say, of when I was just about to turn 2, that I'm dating myself, but that was when Apollo 11 landed on the moon. And as my parents tell me, I was absolutely entranced. If you look at Artemis now, you look at Apollo then, the parallels are obvious. You know, we're returning to the moon with Artemis. We're doing it against the backdrop of great power competition, and most of all, we're looking at it with a sense of wonder and excitement. There are obvious differences too. We're going to the moon with Artemis, but we're not stopping there. We're going to be going on to Mars. The crew, which was just announced yesterday or this morning, is a diverse group of astronauts, 4 of them. I've heard it said that for Apollo, we chose the same astronauts, we just copied him, and it was always a white male over and over and over. You look at the crew that we have for this mission and for future missions, and it will really reflect the diversity of our country and our partners, so that's great. Strategic competition, there are similarities, but there are vast differences. I know we were talking in previous sessions about decoupling, about the challenges of working with and in competition with China, and those are real and they're substantial, and we're just going to have to work our way through it. Not least because, as Andrew Shearer's panel pointed out, 2 of our pressing challenges globally, climate change and dealing with pandemic diseases, we can't do that without the active cooperation of China, so it's not tenable for us to decouple, yet strategic competition is very much real. A final difference, I'd say, is the role of the private sector, and we're going to be getting into this substantially in this session. Apollo was very much in the tradition of the Manhattan Project. It was a big government, big money effort, and it had effective results. Artemis is a hybrid. You know, there's still big government, there's still big money, but it's involves the private sector in a way that Apollo really didn't. In fact, Artemis 3, as I understand, will involve the active participation of SpaceX and their landing module. So it was a great couple of sessions that we had this morning, and we have a great panel here, so I know enough to say my piece and get out of the way, but let me just close with a couple of thoughts. First, as Andrew Shearer was pointing out, what we're dealing with requires management of risk. Projects this ambitious and this important can never be completely de-risked, and nor should we try. That shouldn't be our goal. The question is how we apprehend risk, which always changes, and how we manage that risk set against a technological and geostrategic context that is also always changing. Second thing I'd like to point out is the value of collaboration, and this is a theme that runs through all of these sessions. Artemis is a consortium. It's not just the US going it alone, and proudly a member of this consortium is Australia. If you want to see one movie that sort of encapsulates the spirit, watch The Dish, and I don't need to tell the audience here what that's all about. Let me just conclude by saying when Apollo first started, President Kennedy famously said, "We're doing this not because it's easy, but because it's hard." Now, a half century later, I'm working for President Kennedy's daughter at our embassy in Canberra, and I think she's animated by the same spirit, that we're doing this against a backdrop that isn't easy, and we're doing it because it's hard and because it's valuable. So with that, I'll sit down, and I look forward to the panel. Thanks, Beck.
Thank you, Mike, for those excellent opening remarks. So we've convened this conversation for you today, and thank you for joining us virtually, Chirag. We've got Brigadier-General Mastalir, and again, thanks Mike, for sitting down with us too. There are some really important developments taking place in the space domain. For me, possibly more than any other technology area, the capabilities that we're seeing being applied to, in and from space will have a huge impact on the trajectory of humanity, including the way that we live and work, both on and off Earth. Now, there are several technological breakthroughs that have coalesced to create the opportunities that we are seeing today that are so consequential. And here I'm talking about advances in miniaturization, in modularization, reusability, importantly, in robotics and automation, technologies that we'll be talking about consistently through the next few days. And the list goes on. But what is probably most striking, and this is very consistent with what we've already heard, and I expect we will continue to hear through the next few days, but it is the commercial sector, supported especially in the space domain in some really important ways by government policy and investment. It's the commercial sector that has driven what we are now talking about as a new space race. Now, nowhere has this been more pronounced than in the United States, and there's no doubt that the US has benefited from a genuine capability lead sustained over decades. But anyone that you speak to in the space community, even and perhaps especially in the US, is worried about the erosion of that lead and how they go about sustaining or in fact extending it. And the space domain is one where this is really going to matter. Now, Mike said earlier as well, space is hard. You will notice that we did have Dan Hart, the CEO of Virgin Orbit, originally scheduled for this panel. That company has hit some hard times, and I'm sad to say that he's not able to join us today, obviously. It was a really inspired team and an inspiring team and a great capability that I hope finds its way back, but it really does underline just how important that consistency of investment, how important government as a customer is to space, but also just this, again, we've got to get this balance right of how we work with the commercial sector as government. So here today to unpick a lot of these questions, I want to get into what is this democratisation of space? It's really opened up to a range of actors, not only commercial, but other nations that were never part of that first space race. And how do partners come into what the US is thinking about? Why are the lines blurring so much between civil, commercial and military space? And how does this impact national and international policy and how we think about securing space? It's very clear that space is no longer a sanctuary. It is not immune from the geopolitics of Earth. And in fact, I'm starting to think that what happens in space has the potential to significantly disrupt the geopolitics that we see here on Earth. So I am going to start with our online attendee, and Chirag, thank you so much. It's late at night where you are in Washington, DC right now. My first question is going to be to you, but I'd love this to be a conversation, so please feel free to jump in. The US government has created, and it still actively drives the commercial sector in the US. Now, if we talk about the launch sector, for example, the US DoD's National Security Space Launch Program created a launch duopoly between SpaceX and United Launch Alliance. It did this because it wanted to assure the US DoD's access to orbital space launch capability. Now, recently there's been an announcement that Phase 3 will permit newer actors to be a part of this ecosystem. So my question to you is more generally, even beyond launch and beyond the United States, does the US government have a clear vision for a global space industry? And if so, Chirag, what is that?
Well, wonderful. Well, it's not late at the White House. This is just another day. So thank you guys very much for the opportunity, and my most sincere apologies that I'm not able to attend in person. But as our good DCM just noted, we had a very great announcement today of the announcement of our Artemis II crew to include, the first non-American astronaut to go to the moon and back. So we're very excited about all this represents, both from a scientific, technical perspective, but also from, as you pointed out, a geopolitical perspective as well. I think in this day and age, it's, and I'm really, and just one other thanks real fast to the organizers here. General Mastalir and I go to plenty of space events where space people talk about space stuff to other space people. And it's really great and important, I think, to be able to ensure that what we talk about space is not just to ourselves, and we can do this for quite some time, but also to talk to audiences like this and talk about the importance of space and how the derivatives of space provide the benefits to humanity. As Vice President Harris, as our chair of the National Space Council, also says, it's about how space provides for people on Earth and the opportunities that space provides, whether we're talking about security, combating the climate crisis, or the inspiration that it provides to a STEM and skilled technical workforce. So thank you all very much for allowing us to have an opportunity to talk about our favorite subject in a broader, diverse group here. For those who may not know, about a decade ago, I worked actually with General Mastalir and others in the Obama administration when I was at the National Security Council. And the space industry looked vastly different than it did, it does today. A decade ago, for what it's worth, our policies, they're pretty much the same, which is use commercial capabilities to the maximum extent that we can and ensure that the United States has a healthy and productive space industry. When I was in the Obama administration, we significantly pushed for and funded the transition from the space shuttle and some of our allied partner capabilities to commercial cargo capabilities to include companies like SpaceX to allow them to get a step up, as well as now Northrop Grumman. And we also implemented a policy which was controversial at the time about, it is the holy grail as we speak today, of course, of humans, of astronauts going to and from the space station. That was always seen as inherently governmental. And now we're seeing this as private companies that are providing services towards this. And this has enabled companies, like I said, like SpaceX, Northrop Grumman, Sierra Space is developing cargo capabilities as well. But it's that historical lineage, that evolution of capability that now, to what we just heard about, we are going to have landing systems on the moon as services from commercial companies, spacesuits as commercial companies, and yes, even the entire International Space Station will be decommissioned at the end of this decade. We're transitioning to commercial space stations as well. And that really allows us to save, number one, save billions of dollars. Number two, it allows us to partner even closer with our commercial industry. And number three, it allows us to partner with our allies around the world. And there's countless different partnerships that we have. And from that money, we're able to invest in capabilities. Just in this year's budget for the President Biden, we are investing hundreds of millions of dollars just into commercial space stations. And it's not just for one company. We're doing it as we did with launch. And that's the model that we're using over and over again, which is we allow for some companies to get up to a certain level. then we down select a handful of other companies, and then we down select to one or two ultimate suppliers of capabilities. Now that's on the civil space front. We can talk a lot about NASA through this course development. And I know General Mastalir, sorry to demote you there. On the national security front, look, 80+% of Department of Defense satellite communications is related on commercial satellite, SATCOM. On the remote sensing front, and I think I saw on the agenda, hopefully my boss won't be too mad at me, but Sue Gordon is there hopefully in the audience. And when I was working at the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, we have a strong partnership with the remote sensing industry over 2 decades now. And really that provides an anchor tendency to be able to say the government is being able to invest in you and see all the great things that we've done and that the industry has done. It is now allowing us to combat the climate crisis, allowing us to enable transportation, allowing us to be able to do mining industry. And a lot of that isn't just from purely commercial, but it's layering what we did with government capabilities. Of course, everybody's familiar with GPS. In the Clinton administration, we took off something called selective availability in the Clinton administration. Again, another controversial thing, these military space systems now are going to be used for commercial applications. And now I can't get anywhere without that little blue dot on my phone. And now as we move into the future, and this will be my last point, we're really beginning to partner with novel space industries. We're looking at not just US industry, but we're looking at allied and partner industries. I've had the opportunity to travel the world over the past year, and even more so meet with a lot of different incredible companies. And I think growing the space industry is no longer just growing, just the US elements. I believe that there is global growth amongst like-minded nations, and I believe when we grow, we will grow faster when we grow together. So thank you for the question.
Fabulous, thank you.
If I could just pile on to that. First of all, Chirag, it's great to see you. Believe it or not, your head is actually bigger here in Australia than it normally is in DC. So that's outstanding. But first of all, thanks to ASPE for really a tremendous agenda. It's such important work, such important discussions. The last presentation from Dr. Eric Schmidt really kind of paved the way. And Chirag, just so you know, we're following Dr. Eric Schmidt and his fireside chat, so no pressure, but we have to perform. By the way, I would never have agreed to do this if I knew I was following the former Google CEO. Anyway, Chirag touched on something really important. 10 years ago, when we were sitting in the Eisenhower Executive Office building, kind of pushing the envelope in terms of how do we increase competition, right? And you can increase competition. You talk about a duopoly, but really that was the minimum. That wasn't a maximum, right? So it was a minimum to sustain 2 independent launch companies. Why? Because we know that competition breeds success. And as all free market liberal nations have learned over the years. And he and I struggled with, for example, changing just a very subtle policy, which was the commercial remote sensing policy in terms of what commercial entities would be allowed to sell from 50 centimeter resolution to 25 centimeter resolution. His job was to kind of lead the interagency through this. My job was to get the DoD on board. And that was a bugger of a time because the DoD did not want better commercial resolution made available on the open market for obvious reasons. But we knew back then that it's that competition and those subtle changes that really is what we have today as a result of some of those policy issues that Chirag championed 10 years ago. So it's really exciting to see where we, as the DoD, civil, commercial space, how far we've come, and really where we're likely headed.
Yeah, look, thank you for those additional comments, and I think you highlight something that's really important for us to hold on to as well. We do know how to do this, and we have been doing it for a long time. Now we may need to do it faster and in a greater breadth of technologies and a greater breadth of agencies, but we do know how to do it. Swinging to this national security conversation and the DoD, of course, the United States Space Force is a reasonably recent evolution, but it's made really significant progress in integrating space capabilities into the joint force. Again, another really important achievement. And what that's done is help create or bring the space domain out of the shadows, so to speak. And we're seeing this again in the context of Ukraine. With intelligence, it's really important that some of these capabilities are brought into the light. What it's also done is highlighted the importance of space as a warfighting domain. So I'd like to just start to zero in right now on a concept that we're talking about a lot, and in competition, you want to win. Right, so can you talk to me a little bit, please, about what space superiority is, and why does that matter for the US and its partners?
No, it's a great question. Just to level the bubble for everyone in the audience. So the U.S. Space Force activated in 2019. So we're 2019, and we just turned 3 years old. It was December of 2019. So the space component that we activated just last November is the first U.S. Space Force service component to a terrestrial geographic combatant commander. So Indo-PACOM, my boss, Admiral Aquilino. And every day we go to work with the primary goal of maintaining a free and open Indo-Pacific. Stability in this region is our number one goal. So we'll talk about things like space superiority and warfighting domains. That's not the goal. The goal is to maintain stability and a free and open Indo-Pacific. So let's just set that right up front. So conceptually, space superiority is relative degree of dominance at a point in time. It's really no different than air superiority. And it's operationally, it allows U.S. and ally coalition forces to derive benefits from space without prohibitive interference. At the same time, having the ability to deny the adversary to use space to target U.S. ally coalition forces. So is it important? Yes, it is absolutely critical to win any military conflict on the battlefield today. Modern warfare depends on space and space superiority. The CSO, General Saltzman, who just took over a few months ago, has laid out this theory of victory, and a lot of it is about space superiority, but it's called competitive endurance. Because right now, in this AOR in particular, we are in this period of competition, going back to kind of the banner of this discussion. We're in a period of competition, and historically, nuclear-armed nations don't fight one another. They compete, and they compete right here in the Indo-Pacific. And our job is to try to generate some competitive endurance so that through our efforts in the space domain, integrated with the other warfighting domains, that we can remain competitive and create and be an important part of that integrated deterrence. That's why it's really important that we're here today, because Australia is a huge partner in that effort of generating integrated deterrence in this region. So what is the theory of victory? Well, you need to avoid operational surprise. And that goes to exquisite space domain awareness. That's really understanding what is happening in the environment, having a level of awareness of that warfighting domain, no different than the admiral, in a carrier strike group wants in the maritime domain. And today we don't have that. Today, what we want to do is we want to be able to watch the football match as it's happening. And this is the analogy that the General Saltzman likes to use. We want to watch the football match while it's happening. Today, we're actually just reading the highlights of what happened in the next day's newspaper, right? So we don't have that real-time, exquisite space domain awareness. And that's going to be fundamental to establishing that space superiority that you talk about. And then there are other elements of it that we're going to continue to build out. But those are some of the, when you think about Ukraine, right, and this is kind of an important point, and I don't know if Chirag would agree with me on this, but I would argue that Russia entered that conflict with space superiority, and then commercial showed up, and it became the great equalizer. And I think we witnessed a paradigm shift almost as significant as what we saw in Desert Storm, which many dubbed the first space war. And that paradigm shift is now commercial showing up on the battlefield and leveling the playing field for an adversary that every nation who aspires to achieve spacefaring status was paying attention to what is happening in Ukraine.
Yeah, excellent, beautifully put, and I really love that you brought this back to that the ultimate goal is stability and deterrence, and the role of this region in particular of integrated deterrence. And you did mention this, but a really, really important move from the United States to integrate the first Space Force element into Indo-PACOM. This is the first combatant command that has embedded Space Force, right? Interesting and fun times, Mike, to be here, especially with a Kennedy as ambassador. Have you noticed any difference, just in the last couple of years with the prominence of Space Force, commercial space?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think we pointed out how the Artemis program, which Australia signed on to just a couple years ago, has really pushed collaboration on space to in the direction that we already have with interoperability among our militaries in general, and we've had for decades with the intelligence communities through the Five Eyes. Space now is entering that arena with the additional complexity that we have commercial entities in a way that we didn't before, and I think you alluded to Starlink in Ukraine. I think it's a game changer for all of us, but it's also prompting us to reevaluate where technology and where commercial applications of technology can lead us. And I think Australia in that regard has some innate advantages. The way Australia does hypersonics, the way Australia does swarm technology, I think that offers a lot of good insights. We talked earlier about AUKUS. AUKUS has been a real propellant across the board, not just in the sort of Pillar 1 submarine realm, but with all of the promising technologies in Pillar 2. And I think what this is going to do is it's going to open the aperture and challenge our thinking across all of these domains, including space. So I think we'll see some real interesting spillover from AUKUS into our space communications as well.
Yeah, brilliant, thank you. Nice segue, actually, and I'd like to come back to you, Chirag, if I may. The commercial actors on the battlefield issue and the way that we're working together now, it's both an opportunity, but it presents some challenges too, right? So I'm really interested in how you're thinking about this, and especially as we see a challenged rules-based order here on Earth. How do we extend these ideas of rules and of working together and policy frameworks into space, even as they are challenged here on Earth?
Yeah, that's a great point, and kudos to General Mastalir for some excellent points. I think there's one baselining thing that, again, since we're not talking to a space audience, that we need to note, and now it's not just 10 years ago about well, it actually happened in 2001. There was a seminal report that was called the Rumsfeld Commission that looked at all things about national security space. And, Rumsfeld being the former Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld before he was Secretary of Defense. One of the things that they talked about was the challenges of the potential for a space Pearl Harbor. And inherently what we're talking about there is we rely ever increasingly so much on space that an attack on one particular thing could cause a Pearl Harbor type of event for the United States and its allies and partners. What we've seen over the past 2 decades is, potential adversaries being able to develop weapon systems, not just the ones that are, missiles that are destroying satellites in space, and most recently by the Russians, but certainly by the Chinese, creating hazardous debris that doesn't just affect national security space systems, but affects commercial capabilities as well as civil space capabilities. As a matter of fact, the ISS has had to maneuver a handful of times already to avoid some of this type of debris. And so that's irresponsible behavior that we try to shape. And we don't try to shape unilaterally, we try to shape multilaterally as well. When we talk about a rules-based order, what we're really talking about, there's the international legal environment and regime on one hand, as well as the domestic space regulatory framework on the other hand. And a rules-based international order in space, particularly on the international one, includes the law of armed conflict. And I hope many people are aware of that, the law of armed conflict. It doesn't end, at the surface of the water and doesn't go below the water. It goes all the way to the bottom of the ocean. Same thing, it doesn't end at the atmosphere. The law of armed conflict extends into outer space as well. And additionally, conduct in space is governed by a number of international legal obligations. And we have 4 core UN space treaties that we oblige by. The Outer Space Treaty, the Astronaut Rescue Agreement, which is becoming even more and more applicable in this day and age, the Liability Convention, and the Registration Convention. Now, in the Biden-Harris administration, Vice President Harris released the United States Space Priorities Framework, where we talk about the fact that it's not just the government making these rules, as you've already identified, Beck, very clearly. Commercial industry, allies, partners, we all need to work together to promote the implementation of existing measures, like I've talked about, but we also need to lead new measures that contribute to all forms of things, from safety, stability, security, and even the long-term sustainability of the outer space environment. Just as terrestrially, we're concerned about pollution and environmentalism on the Earth, it's the same thing we need to think about in the outer space environment, where we all operate together. Commercial, civil, national security, allies and partners, and strategic competitors. We use the entire environment together. And in this administration, we've been very active on this. As Mike just talked about, we have really focused on the Artemis Accords, which is really now expanded to 23 nations. I expect that group to continue to grow, and many of the nations speaking in this forum are signatories of that. Another area of effort is with regards to destructive direct ascent anti-satellite missile testing. This is what Russia did back in just a couple years ago. This is what China has done. And really what this is doing is leaving long-term debris that is really difficult to track, and it becomes even more difficult at times to be able to get out of its way. Because we're talking about thousands of pieces of trackable debris, but then there's thousands of pieces of untrackable debris too. And so if something hits something else and we don't see it hit, that can be catastrophic for many different types of satellites. And so in 2022, the Vice President announced the United States unilateral commitment not to conduct such activities. And happily, this led to a successful effort across the United Nations General Assembly to build international support for making this commitment into an international norm of responsible space behavior. 155 UN member states supported the resolution on this topic. And we're working with our UN open-ended working group, which, by the way, includes China, which includes Russia, to talk about where is space, an area where we can cooperate on some of these rules. Now, domestically, we have 3 regulatory regimes. We have the Federal Communications Commission for spectrum. We have the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration for Earth remote sensing. And we have the Federal Aviation Administration for the launch and reentry of rockets. But as I think many people are becoming more and more aware, there's so many new capabilities that are being developed. On-orbit servicing, lunar mining, space depots and propellants. And we need to develop best practices, industry standards, and ultimately someday also regulations to be able to ensure that all these capabilities are governed in a way that are internationally compatible, but also in a way that are taking into account the sustainability of the space environment. And so that's one of the things that my office is particularly doing from the direction of the Vice President of the National Space Council, is looking on how these novel space activities can be incorporated into our broader environment. And so we can really enable the private sector to continue to flourish and continue to be able to support both government activities, international activities, and of course, commercial activities. Thank you.
Excellent, thank you so much. Now, I've been ridiculously overambitious with the number of questions that I have prepared for this panel, so I'm going to do a quick combination of a couple more, but luckily my panelists have actually touched on a lot of what I wanted to do anyway. But both Brigadier-General Mastalir and Chirag, you've touched on the sustainability issue, and it's great that there's a focus on this right as we go. You know, we're on the cusp of starting to launch a lot more into the space environment. So thinking about how we're deorbiting and how we're removing debris and how we're bringing things back out of the space environment's really interesting and really important. But just thinking about launch cadence, there are some estimates that see a combined sort of US and commercial need to get to numbers like 200, 300, even 400 launches per year. Now, if we think about the fact that in 2022, there were about 62, and the majority of those by the US came from the Cape and from Vandenberg and just one or two other spaceports. So my first question, I guess, from your perspective, as you're thinking about getting that exquisite space awareness, situational domain awareness, how do we get there? How does the US get there? How does the world get there? And then obviously we need to think about new launch facilities and new launch locations. And then Chirag, I might ask you to come in on this, and Mike, feel free, please. But how does this gel with the something like the Missile Technology Control Regime, right? Which was designed to prevent proliferation of these kinds of vehicles that can put WMD, bring that into play, which is something we certainly don't want to do, and we do not technologies that we do want to proliferate. But that regime was designed both in and for the previous century. So how do we get to where we think we need to with the regimes that we've got and the facilities that we've got? And I might start with you.
All right. So the space launch is an entire separate conference, to be honest with you, right? So let me just hit some highlights, and you probably pitched it to me because in my prior life I was the commander, installation commander, and wing and delta commander at Vandenberg Space Force Base, our Western Range. We recognized this issue back in 2016-17 timeframe, and we started down a path that we call Range of the Future, and part of that was autonomous flight safety systems, which we forced onto the commercial enterprise to come up. We gave them the core algorithms and said, now make it work, make it flight worthy. And SpaceX did that, right? They were the first to come to the market with an autonomous flight safety system. And a bunch of other improvements to the range. Now, why are we doing this? We're trying to increase reps, right? We're trying to decrease the amount of time that it takes in between launches so we can reset launch pads very quickly. Instead of 30 days, we want to get it down to a week. Instead of a week, we're trying to get it down to a day. And in the future, I'm flying to Canberra on Thursday, and if you fly Qantas to Sydney to Canberra, you can start at 7 or 7:30 or 8 or 8:30 or 9 or 9:30. There's a flight every 30 minutes, and that's what we need to do with our launch ranges. We need to be able to. You're going to see launches that are going several times a day from our facilities. There's another important aspect to this, and I touched on it earlier, which is space domain awareness. We are seeing, because of the threats that Chirag has laid out, we are seeing a move to these massively proliferated low Earth orbits. And they're doing that in a lot of ways because of the inherent resilience that kind of architecture gives you. It's very difficult. GPS was probably the first, by design, it was inherently resilient because you can't shoot down one GPS satellite and knock it out. So you have a situation where not only are you trying to increase reps on the launch pad, but now you're trying to get a clean launch vector. So think about the Frogger game where you're trying to jump across 3 lanes of traffic, and that's what you're going to see in low Earth orbit. So trying to resolve a green launch vector, right now we go by the minute. You're going to have to get down to 15-second, down to 1-second launch vectors. And those launch windows are going to be tighter. And in order to do that safely, you have to have the exquisite space domain awareness. And that is one of the areas that I think through partnering with allies, Australia is a big partner in this area, partnering with commercial, we can bring more capability to kind of resolve those launch vectors by removing uncertainty in the space domain awareness. This is going to continue because the cost of launch is dropping precipitously, right? When you talk about National Security Space Launch Phase 3, the significant change with our Phase 3 is the way we're competing it is instead of having the commercial launch provider hit all 8 reference orbits, you're going to have an option to just hit the lower orbits versus the higher orbits. So that opens up to new innovation from, say, Firefly, who's building carbon fiber rockets, to say Relativity, who successfully last month launched the first 3D printed rocket. And I say successfully because that first stage made it through max Q, which is the point of most extreme atmospheric pressure is testing the structural integrity of that booster. Yeah. It failed on the second stage. That's small potatoes. Well, they'll work through that. They made it through max Q with a 3D printed booster. So when you think about in the future, International Space Station type, so where is that manufacturing depot in space that's 3D printing the parts that we need to colonize Mars, for example? Where is the refueling depots? Where are we going to look at rocket cargo? I mean, these new companies, the new space, because of the innovation that they're bringing to the market, are going to be bringing just really amazing capability. And so we have got to solve the launch capacity issue, and we're working hard on that.
Super. Thank you. Chirag, can I throw to you?
Yeah, just for the non-space people in the audience, max Q is what happens after max P.
Okay. It's very helpful. Thank you.
That's our White House, ladies and gentlemen.
There you go. No, come. No. Yeah, no. Okay, all right. So there is I'm going to give a very short answer on the launch range element because I think General Mastalir has done a great job of explaining the importance and significance of that. When President Biden released his fiscal year 23 budget, he has this great quote. He actually is quoting his dad. His dad said, "Don't tell me what you value. Show me your budget, and I'll tell you what you value." This year, in the president's fiscal year 2024 release that just came out a few weeks ago, we've invested the first of a significant amount of money over the next 5 years to actually improve that launch range, to actually put the resources behind the narrative, behind the needs. In this case, we're investing just for next year, $100 million for launch range infrastructure projects to increase exactly what General Mastalir said, the launch capacity. But I think what you'll see as we release subsequent budgets, that number is going to significantly increase because the needs for launch are very important for our national security purposes, but having that range of the future, as General Mastalir stated, is also important to ensure that we have a robust commercial enterprise, because the better that commercial enterprise is, the more we from the government can continue to leverage it. It's kind of like a flywheel effect there. So, but let me just briefly mention as well on the MTCR issue. Our non-proliferation obligations are, I believe, still compatible with the space industry, but there are things that we need to evolve along the way. Just last month, our administration announced that due to our obligations for MTCR, we have had policies providing support or encouragement to foreign space launch vehicles But that's the technology. A lot of that technology is the same used in missile programs. Implementing these policies has often led to really restrictions or confusions being applied to commercial satellites and satellite components that are planned to be launched on space launch vehicles, that we did not support or encourage, basically non-MTCR nations. But because of the recognition of the growing space cooperation environment, our office, alongside the National Security Council and the Department of Commerce, undertook a careful review of how MTCR policy was being interpreted. And because of this effort, we were able to announce a clarification of that policy. And basically what that says is that license applications for the export of satellites and satellite components to MTCR partners will now be reviewed on a case-by-case basis, which seems limiting, but I'll tell you, it used to be on the presumption of denial. And really what we're talking about is being able to democratize, as that term was used earlier today, the efforts of space. And this is even if the launch vehicle is one that the United States may not have encouraged under the MTCR regime. And it's subtle, but it is as what General Mastalir said earlier, some of the most subtle policy changes that we make now make a big difference along the way. Often when I go around to universities and other institutions, learning institutions, one of the questions I'm often asked about is, how do you measure change in the world of policy? And they say, wait 10 years, look back and see if that little change, that little bend in the arc of history made a change in the longer journey here. The value that I have, when I was at the National Security Council from 2010 to 2016, alongside General Mastalir and a handful of many others, we're able to really make a significant difference in being able to come back to the White House as the Executive Secretary of the National Space Council. I've actually been able to look back at some of the work that we've done, and while painful and excruciating on some days, weeks, months, and sometimes even years, I do believe that we as a government, and I don't mean just we as a government in the United States, but our international allies and partners, making some of these subtle changes today really enables us to be able to develop, the space industry and the space governance and the allies and partnerships that we need in the future. So really thank you very much again for the opportunity, Beck, and look forward to having a following conversation with whoever would like.
Wonderful. Look, I've committed the sin of being over time without throwing to questions. We are very lucky that we have Brigadier-General Mastalir with us for the 2 days. That's right, isn't it? And we have Deputy Chief of Mission Mike Goldman. We don't have Chirag for any longer, I'm sorry, but it's my commitment that we're going to bring you back, Chirag, and we're going to try and get you here in person in future. Look, media folks at the back, there's going to be a mic made available for you for sessions that do have the time for questions. So please don't feel that you can't. For now, please do make the most of the breaks and follow up any conversations or questions that you want to have. Chirag, thank you so much for staying up late for us, although I know you said it's not late. And please join me in thanking this terrific panel for a great conversation. Thank you.